Good day, everybody. Randy Franklin Smith here, and today we're talking about one of those first-time topics that always gets me excited, and this is firmware. Wow, talk about timely. Check out this. Check out this. Only 2 days old on Ars Technica. Discovery of a new UEFI rootkit exposes an ugly truth. The attacks are invisible to us. And I mean, this headline is like made for today's webinar. Turns out they're not all that rare. We just don't know how to find them. So this is just awesome. I'm super excited. As you can tell, I want to thank Eclipsium for making today's webinar possible. This is the first time we've ever had Eclipsium as a sponsor. And you'll see what they do shortly, but as you might guess, it has something to do with firmware. I want to introduce Nate Warfield and Gary Mandelstam. Both of these gentlemen eat, sleep, and think firmware security nowadays. True?
Yeah, well, that's the truth, Randy.
And Nate, you want to just talk a little bit about what you were doing before you started focusing on firmware security at Eclipsium?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, I've been in cybersecurity in one way or another since, well, I guess since I was a kid, hacking into BBSs. Before I was here, I spent about 7 years at Microsoft. I spent 4 years working for the Patch Tuesday team, running the Windows patching process. My claims to fame were the WannaCry patch. I helped push that out. Spectre Meltdown, which is also firmware related. So yeah, I've been doing cybersecurity professionally for probably about 10 years now. And yeah, now I am the Director of Threat Research and Intelligence at Eclipsium. So my team hunts this type of stuff, builds detections, tries to develop new ways and exotic ways of protecting firmware across both like laptops, servers, network devices, and IoT.
Nate, you really dated yourself with that reference to BBSs. I wonder how many people on the webinar know what those are, but I just have one question for you. Would you like to play a game?
I wasn't 300 baud. I wasn't the handset modems. I was 2400 is what I started at, but yes, I get the reference.
All right, cool. Well, today we're going to talk about the fact that everything's got firmware, and that the definition of firmware is getting expanded, maybe for good or for bad. But you know, we're going to focus in on PC firmware. And we're going to talk about some important facts. Yeah, Michael says cars have lots of firmware. Great point. And here's some of the scary parts of this, right? That firmware is remotely accessible. Firmware frequently has a network attack surface. Firmware can be modified. Firmware needs to be patched. It's hard to detect. It's a great target. And we're going to talk about some real-world firmware attacks. So what is firmware? Listen, I've got a few quotes here in the webinar because there's some sites that just, I can't say it better. But you know, the big thing is traditionally, and what we have on this page is the classic definition of firmware. It's low-level code that is very, very specific to a specific piece of hardware, and it does, like, you know, low level, and the word I'm looking for is fundamental or base level operations. There's another good point here. For you know, less complex devices, firmware may be the entire software footprint for that device. It used to be, I don't know if anybody remembers, I'm sure Nate does, it used to be the way you updated firmware was unplugging a EEPROM or ROM chip and plugging a new one in. Needless to say, firmware did not get updated much back then. But then firmware became where it was stored on flash memory, and we could reprogram it with a special procedure. It usually required booting a purpose-built utility for that purpose. I just thought an interesting point here. You can't talk about firmware without the fact that it has bugs. And bugs are a generalized term for a subset of bugs called vulnerabilities, right? So there you go. Even in the most abstract discussion of firmware, this comes up. So why is this such a big deal? Why is firmware so important to security? It's because it is the root of trust. You know, in the webinars I deal with, especially since my website and all that, its roots were security, were Windows security, operating system level security. We spend a lot of time talking about operating system security. And in the world we live in, it's convenient to just kind of view, Nate, security, to view the operating system as our foundation for security. But that is so far from the truth. Firmware is much, much closer to your foundation for security, and your OS. Nate, do you agree with me when I say that your OS is only as secure as your firmware?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is, before your operating system starts, be it Windows, Mac OS, Linux, any of them, the hardware has to sort of bootstrap itself. It has to have code that runs all your processors, your network cards, your video driver, everything has firmware. And if that can't be trusted, the operating system doesn't know what's underneath it. So it's easy to sort of lie to the operating system about what's going on if you compromise the firmware.
Absolutely. So what else, though, is firmware? Now, here we'll get into the expanded definition. Firmware today is often used to encompass the entire OS that resides in flash memory on all kinds of smart devices, whether that's corporate things like routers and other network appliances like from F5 or whatever, to cameras, and sad to say, even toasters. And other folks realize this, like the Debian website points out that well-defined boundaries between firmware and software don't exist. So nowadays, firmware oftentimes refers to some form of Linux running on, God knows what out there. Nate?
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned F5, we refer to their stuff as firmware, but at the end of the day, it is a CentOS Linux version. You mentioned cameras. A lot of those things are running some stripped down version of Linux. Your home commodity cable modem routers are probably running Linux. It's moved beyond being, custom built software that's, designed for a specific piece of hardware to the advantages of open source and Linux is that it makes it very easy for hardware developers to say, hey, I want an operating system that runs my thing, and then there's a fully functional OS they can just, modify a little bit and put on their machines.
So when we talk about firmware for PCs, that is laptops, desktops, and servers, we kind of mean one thing. Then when we talk about firmware for devices, we're really talking about all the software running on that device frequently. And it's kind of a weird thing. I think it's just called firmware because it resides on a chip as opposed to being booted from a hard drive. I think that's largely, the reason why firmware is used for that expanded terminology. I don't know what you think about that, Nate. Like, why did they call it firmware? Why don't they call it the device's OS?
Well, I don't know why they did it, but my theory is that, we think of an operating system. The operating system is more sort of to be the user interface to a computer, right? Your Mac OS, your Windows, it's how your average user interacts with the computing device versus the devices that run firmware, routers, all these other things. They're not really end user devices, right? They're infrastructure. There's things that are designed to invisibly perform a task, and sort of to that end, inside your, laptop, all of those, the chips and all the, drive controllers and all these other things, those aren't something that you need to actually interact with. It's just, this is the code that runs these things sort of behind the scenes to make everything work.
Fair enough. Paul points out that the original idea was that firmware is the stuff that runs between hardware and software. Fair enough. Okay, so let's zero in on what is firmware on PCs. So I found some great points that are brought out at this particular website. It's a Linux-related website. It's a Linux project devoted to managing or dealing with firmware issues for Linux. But whether you're talking about Windows or anything else on a PC, all of these factors apply. And here are some of the key points that really lend weight and credence to the claims we're making about security in today's webinar. And that is the fact that thanks to firmware, there's several layers that run between the hardware and the OS. And this keeps going even after the boot process is done. So sometimes people think of UEFI as just what gets you to the operating system loading up. But there's lots of stuff that keeps running in the form of firmware, even while the OS is running. And this is crazy to me, even when the computer is quote unquote off. One of them is the Intel Management Engine. I've got an entire slide devoted to that, so I won't get into it now. And so another related project, Linux Boot, the way they put it is there's at least 2.5, it's funny, 2.5 kernels running between hardware and Linux, or you could say between hardware and Windows. And a lot of this firmware is surprisingly complex and capable with full network stacks. So you see, that's why I've been harping on the point that a lot of firmware has a network attack surface, Nate.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned, Intel ME. These are technologies designed for like mass management of systems, and I come from a very heavy network engineering background, and some of the folks on this call may remember the wake on LAN concept, where you can send a magic packet to a computer and have it suddenly wake up out of sleep mode. Well, that means that there's some operating system that's running, listening for that magic packet that has access to the network.
Yeah, exactly. So it means that, most Intel computers are potentially vulnerable unless you unplug the mains power. As long as the mains power is plugged in, you have a network presence. And if you have a network presence that is looking at, reading incoming packets and parsing them, processing them, then you have an attack surface. There's just no way around it. Here's the other thing I want you to notice here. Large foundation of code that is proprietary and unaudited. We'll talk about that more as we go along. So all of this presents all kinds of opportunities for powerful, persistent exploits and rootkits. So here's some specifics. PC firmware. Yes, part of it is UEI, but then there's also the TPM chip, and this stuff has remote management. There's other technologies. Pluton doesn't seem like it's really getting it was a Microsoft initiative, but I'm already kind of using the past tense on it because it seems like the PC vendors were not on board with it. This is all I'm going to say about Pluton is however much we talk about it here on this slide. Nate, what's your perspective on that coming from Microsoft?
I mean, it was Microsoft, for all their faults, they do have a very large security team, and obviously being one of the most targeted operating systems, it's sort of, behooves them to try and secure their ecosystem. I think Pluton was probably a good concept, but like you said, it wasn't really well received by the industry. And if they can't, I think Dell was not too interested in running it. So without OEM support to actually put these chips into their devices, it just kind of isn't there's no chance for it to be really successful.
It's a non-starter.
Yeah.
Let's get into UEFI more. So this is the software interface between your OS and your platform firmware. So UEFI is a specification. It's basically an API. Every hardware vendor out there is free to do its own implementation of the firmware running behind the UEFI interface that it services. It replaces the good old BIOS. There you go again, the remote diagnostics and control. It controls the boot process, and the other big thing is it serves as the system's root of trust for software. So the very beginning, as you can see in the diagram here of UEFI, is the security phase where it's initializing the firmware and then going on to low-level firmware, loading device drivers that are required for the boot process, then figuring out which bootloader should I use, and allowing that to take over to where things are finally handed over to the operating system kernel, and then finally the user mode processes like mostly Ring 3 processes that the kernel runs. So UEFI, is oftentimes thought of as what gets your boot process, your bootstrap process done, but there continue to be services that UEFI provides to the OS even while it's running. Anything else you want to bring out about UEFI here, Nate? And it's okay if you don't. We'll talk about TPM
I think
next.
you summarized it pretty well. I will point out for the audience that in this slide, DXE in this diagram, this is where the cosmic strand implant was basically targeted at, right? It's and we'll get more into details about it, but yeah, that it targets that specific portion of UEFI.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out, because look at how early in this whole process that particular vulnerability resides. It's crazy, and the whole cosmic strand thing just demonstrates exactly what we're talking about today. So another important thing that's kind of in the firmware world are TPM chips. This was the predecessor to Pluton. The TPM chip is ubiquitous in business laptops and servers in general today. It's a security crypto processor. So it's got its own little CPU and persistent memory. And one of the main things that it can do is generate keys, and that's both symmetric and asymmetric public-private key pairs, and then keep those private keys there on that chip to where they never leave. So in some ways, it has elements of a hardware security module. But then this allows us to do things like remote attestation. What is that? That's where this device can wake up and it can scan the motherboard and all the devices on the motherboard and say, here's the hardware I've detected, and here's the versions of firmware and other junk that's running on it, and it hasn't changed since last time. And thanks to some embedded keys on it, it can sign that attestation and provide a level of trust to remote parties that, okay, this device has some integrity at the platform level. The TPM is also part of disk encryption, specifically in Windows. What am I thinking of? The disk encryption in Windows.
BitLocker is what you're thinking of.
BitLocker, thank you. I was thinking bootlocker, and I'm like, no. Yeah, BitLocker. Yeah, there's different ways you can store a encryption key for the encryption key of bootlocker. You can even have to enter it manually in order for the system to start up. But the most convenient and arguably the most secure way is to, at least in the corporate commercial world with end users, is to store it on the TPM chip. And so the TPM chip is responsible to start up, scan the all the hardware present, and to say, yep, doesn't look like anybody's plugged in anything or replaced the BIOS or other firmware. I'll go ahead and give up the symmetric encryption key for the hard drive to the operating system so that it can read the hard disk. Also, hardware authentication. So this is part of Windows Hello, so that a remote party like the Microsoft Cloud can have assurance as part of like your Azure directory logon requirements that this PC is really the corporate PC assigned to Randy Smith or whoever. All right, but this is firmware, and it can be attacked, and it has been attacked, even though it's explicitly there for security, right? Nate, that's the ironic thing here. A lot of the stuff in UEFI and TPM is there to provide better security, but software is software, and software will have bugs.
Yeah.
And the bad guys will exploit those bugs.
Yep.
Because writing secure code is not easy.
There's a quote that I like from a guy who goes by the Grug, where I believe he says, never attack the standard, attack the implementation.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. That nails it. That nails it across the board, including with encryption, right? Because encryption algorithms oftentimes are really strong, but then it's in the implementation, the messy key management, and so on. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's zero in on something that's come up before. And this is a key piece of powerful firmware that's on every Intel system since, is it 2008? I think it's 2008. Yes, right there. There's the quote. And then, not to be outdone, Intel's big competitor has the same thing. So just by a different name. And what is this? This is the management engine, ME. So check this out. It's got its own MAC and IP address. That immediately to a security person says target. It's got direct access to Ethernet controller. One portion of the Ethernet traffic is diverted to the ME even before reaching the host's operating system. So that sounds like invisible to me, Nate.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the EDR solutions and such will actually look at things coming in via with Windows. It's the ETW subsystem or the event tracing for Windows thing. But if you're bypassing the OS, you're bypassing anything that's looking at the OS level.
Man, that's a great thing you just pointed out there. So it's invisible to EDR. That's something I was thinking about. All this security software nowadays that we run is oftentimes either a user process or maybe it's running at the device driver level, but still that's below the kind of stuff that we're talking about here. So companies are serious about this. As far back as 2017, Google was trying to eliminate proprietary firmware from its servers, and this was an example that you can't disable management engine. And here's what makes it even scarier. It's proprietary and obfuscated. The actual code is obfuscated through, I forget what the technique is called, but the point is you can pull the code out, but it's, I'm not going to use the word encrypted, but it's obfuscated in a way that might as well be encryption because you can't analyze it. Now, of course, there's a lot of really smart people out there that are determined, and they've been able to backward engineer reverse engineer a lot of this, and they've even been able to figure out that what the management engine is at its core is a version of Minix, so minimal Linux. But as we might expect with anything like this, there's tons of vulnerabilities that have been discovered with it. Let's see here. But there's wait, there's more, right? In the best tradition of a infomercial, there's more firmware. So think of RAID controllers, Nate. When you're booting up a server, before you get anywhere close to the operating system, you're given the opportunity to boot into an interface provided by the RAID controller, complete with a command line.
Yep. Yeah, I think Intel actually has a web API for one of their RAID controllers. There's a vulnerability. Like I think it was just a denial of service. But yeah, some of these things you can actually hit a web page and look at your RAID array.
God, it's crazy. Same with NICs, graphic cards, anything on that server or PC has got firmware.
Yeah, and an interesting anecdote on the graphics card thing. One of the vulnerabilities I worked at Microsoft, somebody had found that in NVIDIA, they found a series of vulnerabilities in NVIDIA video cards, or if it's video cards or GPUs, but essentially what it allowed them to do was in Hyper-V, which for anyone that doesn't know is Microsoft's hypervisor that runs Azure and other things. They were able to basically use a flaw in the NVIDIA driver to then gain basically system-level access on the hypervisor host from a guest virtual machine. So that's what that attack service can give you.
Dang. I mean, everything running down at that level oftentimes has access to, like for instance, all the RAM on that system without any regard to, page boundaries and memory allocated to specific processes and so on. So security issues with firmware, great segue, if I do say so myself, it's highly privileged. So, it's running usually at ring 0 or even at a ring not even visible to the CPU potentially. It's usually invisible to the OS, yet it's trusted by the OS. It's software, so that means it's got vulnerabilities. It often has an attack surface on the network, and it's oftentimes ignored. I mean, how many times, how much do we spend? Well, case in point, this is our first webinar ever on firmware, Nate.
Yeah.
It's not subjected to as much scrutiny as your operating system and applications. That's kind of changing, but there's going to be a long time before we catch up. And it's oftentimes obfuscated. So that brings up then the obvious need for patching firmware. First of all, this is a security risk vector, threat vector in its own, because firmware can be replaced or patched or modified. So that means bad guys can insert bad guy code into the firmware. But we also need that capability so that when vulnerabilities like this cosmic strand thing are discovered, we can update the firmware. But how do you update firmware? It's not like there is a WSUS Windows Server Update Services component out there, or is there, Nate? Right?
I mean, I don't. Yeah, there's definitely. You're talking.
No, my point is that's what you guys are here for, right?
Yeah. That's exactly what we're trying to do is help make the keeping either catalogs of what your firmware, your versions are in your environment, and then helping you say, okay, we know we need to update the firmware on this fleet of devices. which, as you mentioned, it's historically very challenging. There is no like patch Wednesday for firmware.
Right, right. And well, here's the other thing. You may have one or two operating systems or however many distros of Linux, but basically two operating systems that you have to patch on your corporate network. But how many firmwares?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and it depends on the OS too, right? I mean, so I've got a Dell laptop, and Dell has a tool that will eventually pop up and say, hey, you need new firmware, and it'll download it all and then reboot and update my BIOS. But depending on what the vendor is supporting, that may not be an automatic process for, say, Linux, or I'm not really a Mac guy, so I can't comment there.
Right. I want to handle this question from Adam. Maybe does the kernel sit on top of the system firmware, or is it synonymous with firmware? No, it sits on top of the firmware. So firmware, like your UEFI firmware, it starts up and interfaces with the hardware at a lower level than the kernel. And the kernel, if it is dealing with your NIC or your graphics card or whatever else, it's really talking to the firmware on those cards. So like the kernel is the lowest level of your operating system. Well, the firmware runs even lower level than that, and the kernel trusts that firmware. Let's see here. Michael says, do MDX agents scan for firmware? Do they know how to patch? Otherwise, you might need like a unique scan and update tool for each. So MDX agents, I'm not following you, Michael. Maybe you know what he's talking about?
It sounds like MDM, which is like mobile device management, which is things like Microsoft Intune, which is sort of to keep track of this, this new bring your own device world that we live in.
Yeah, he says MDM, Intune, and so on. Keep going.
Yeah, so I'm not aware that they do anything at the firmware level. I know, my days at Microsoft, I'm an iPhone guy, and I would get a note from MDM saying, hey, the new iOS is out. You need to upgrade it, or you won't be able to connect to your email on your personal phone. But as far as firmware level things, I don't believe they do. We would also use that for VPNing into Microsoft on, I had a very highly secured specialized laptop, and it would mean the first thing it would do would be check all the patch levels and make sure everything was up to patch status. And then if it was outdated, like if I forgot to patch Tuesday my machine, it would actually not let me VPN into the network. It would say, nope, you need to install your patches. But it never actually asked me about firmware. So my intuition says it probably doesn't look that low.
No, and there's not a standard, right? So that's what makes it hard. Like, does UEFI have a standard for updating implementations of UEFI? I don't think so.
I mean, like, because it's, it's, what is it, user extensible, and it's designed for, any software vendor or hardware vendor to really use, that is going to just depend on how they implemented it. And what, I don't believe most of them alert back up to the operating system saying, hey, my UEFI is outdated, or I've got a new BIOS that needs to get installed. It really is sort of the Wild West, depending on how it's implemented.
Michael says, that is my point. All firmware seems to be very siloed.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. And Steve says patching firmware is, and by the way, that is a great point. If there's something that I wish I could add right now to my bottom line slide, that's that point right there. I just want to amplify it. Firmware is highly siloed today. Steve says patching firmware is a wonderful way to brick a system resulting in denial of service. We will talk more about that. And John asked, do iPhone updates such as iOS 15.6 update the firmware as well as the OS? So now we're getting into mobile device firmware, and as far as I know, yeah, it does. You don't have to do anything. Apple updates really low-level portions of its devices that they just still call it as part of iOS. But yeah, you don't have to bring an iPhone in and plug it into some special cable anymore to update anything on it.
Yeah, most of the cell phones seem to be somewhat better about it than your PCs because or your computing devices, I should say. Because I know there have been some baseband vulnerabilities that were discovered in some of the radio chips that were able to be, it wasn't that you had to flash the device. It was, an OS update, a security patch comes out from Apple or from Google for the Android phones, and magically the baseband vulnerability is gone.
Yep. And here's a great point, another good one, really related to it. So when we talk about firmware being siloed, we really mean PC firmware is highly siloed. So you have two operating systems, Windows and Linux, but you've got all these different firmwares. So, and the contrasting point here with like the iPhone is Michael points out that it's, they own the entire hardware, software, firmware stack, the entire stack, so they can update it. Microsoft and Linux can't do that, and Microsoft, even with all of its clout, can't get hardware vendors to do the whole secure core thing.
Hey,
So
I have a Windows phone somewhere.
right.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm not a Mac guy, but I've been an iPhone user pretty much since they came out. And in my personal opinion, you cannot get a more secure phone than an iPhone. And it's because of exactly that. Apple keeps very tight control. They are the hardware manufacturer. I believe they design their own chips. They control the operating system, so their ecosystem is much tighter. And once you start, you can't even really get much in the way of additional, hardware cards or updates to put inside a Mac. So they're able to keep their ecosystem much tighter than the PC world.
It's true. So detecting firmware hacks. Nate, when you and I were talking about this, I brought up the matrix. It's, remember, and especially early on when Neo was like, it just doesn't, there's something weird about reality, right? And the first time he went in and had that little deja vu feeling, it's like that's the best hints you can get that not that you're running in a simulation, but there's something wrong with the firmware that you're running on top of if you're the OS. Nate?
Yeah, except that the firmware attacks that we see are generally so elegant, and I do give a lot of professional respect to the bad guys just for what they do. Most of these things are nearly impossible to detect. If they write it wrong and all of a sudden your computer starts crashing or it starts doing weird things, that's a giveaway that something's gone sideways, right? Most of these things, they're so well done that you don't know it's there, and that's the entire point of it.
The steak tastes like a steak.
Exactly.
Um,
Ignorance is bliss.
so, yeah, that's the thing. Is that detecting these things is hard. So do you think it's safe to say we really don't know how many firmware malwares are out there? Resident Evil.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we generally learn about them once what their mission was, and we'll get into this, things like what happened in the Ukraine recently. Once they've completed their mission is generally when the world finds out about them. Up until that point, they just sort of lay dormant as far as everyone's concerned.
Okay, so if you're a bad guy, what can you accomplish? Which is kind of a weird word for such a nihilistic behavior. But be that as it may, firmware is fantastic for denial of service and or destructive attacks, which there's, well, no, think of Colonial Pipeline. I was about to say they've kind of slowed down, since Netya or NotPetya. But whether it's an infrastructure attack or just maybe your collateral damage, like the poor Maersk was with NotPetya, forget about stealing secrets and ransomware. In today's increasingly fragmented, deglobalized world, I think we're going to see a lot more regional politically motivated attacks where the bad guy wants nothing more than just to disrupt or render systems inoperable. And it's not going to just be on the electrical grid. Nate?
Yeah. We're definitely seeing that sort of, I'm not a big fan of the term cyber, but I'll use it sort of the cyber warfare component, either for political reasons. I mean, we've seen obviously with NotPetya and other like I think it's Indestroyer and Black Energy malware. The Russians have basically used Ukraine as a testing ground for turning off infrastructure and basically figuring out how to do this. And then as we're seeing, it's becoming a sort of an additional arrow in the quiver along with, more of the kinetic warfare that we see unfolding.
But all of that being said, it's also fantastically valuable as ransomware because, potentially we don't have to encrypt your entire hard drive. All we have to do is get control of your system and deny you access to it, deny its ability to boot up, right? I mean, that's as effective as ransomware for all practical purposes.
Yeah, and in fact, in some cases, the ransomware, like so with NotPetya, while it was designed to look like ransomware. Once it was fully looked at, it turned out it was just a wiper. So there was no way to actually get your data back, which to a certain degree, it just, in businesses will say, okay, we just have to wipe everything and reinstall it or buy new hard drives or what have you. With ransomware, because you don't actually have to render the system unbootable. You can, a lot of them, what we're seeing is they will encrypt like the Exchange server mail store, so all the email is gone. They'll encrypt all the SQL databases, all the databases are gone, all of the, documentation, all the financial records or whatever is being stored that's valuable, they just lock that up. And then, of course, problem is as we've seen, some of this becomes collateral damage where you say, okay, well, if my payment system requires access to a database, by encrypting that database, you've taken offline tons of ATMs or banks, or maybe the system controls, skill like with Maersk, right? They were unable to unload their ships because everything that handled unloading the ships had been ransomware. So all of a sudden those big, my kids call them the dinosaurs that hang out near the ports couldn't operate. So you had miles and miles and miles of 18-wheelers waiting to unload cargo ships that couldn't do it, right? So they're the sort of shockwave of these attacks can go, almost infinitely.
And Maersk wasn't firmware, but the point is we could easily accomplish the same thing, and Nate even has an example of that. And then finally, is firmware useful for APT? Man, absolutely. Talk about being advanced and persistent and having a long-term presence without being discovered. Firmware is the perfect place for an APT attack to live. Adam says, are there any examples out there that we could look at to get an idea of what firmware malware is doing? He says, I'm mostly looking for some clarity on why we can't see that it's there. Can we not interrogate the firmware? Does the firmware have some weird way of communicating out that we can't observe? All of that is true. All of that is true, Adam. As we just covered one example of how it can communicate, right? Management Engine has its own IP and MAC address on that network card, and that traffic is diverted to it. The operating system never sees it. Think about this, Adam. You have an application. Can the application scan the operating system to verify that there's no rootkit installed? No, because anything that application does will be intercepted by the operating system, and then if it's saying, okay, well, I want to look at this first sector of the disk, well, where does that request go to? It goes to the OS through, a Win32 API or a syscall on Linux, and then the operating system services that. So the operating system could say, I'm going to send you back something else than what's really there on that sector. Nate?
Yeah, I mean, I think with your operating system, you're talking about like the lower level firmware, because as we'll kind of talk about with Cosmic Strand, once it's in UEFI, anything that, like you say, the OS goes and says, I want to scan this sector of the hard drive, the UEFI can say, oh yeah, well here, I will just return you this data structure, and this is clean, and the OS will say, okay, well the lower the system below me told me that this sector of the drive is the data that was given to me. It doesn't know that it's being lied to.
Yeah. Okay, so bottom line is compromised firmware is arguably more dangerous than a compromised operating system. And the bad guys are already exploiting this. So, it's whatever o'clock, do you know where your firmware is? And Nate is going to take over now and talk about some real world firmware attacks. And then we're going to show you some technology to help you get a handle on all of this. So Nate?
Yep. I think this probably needs to be advanced a little bit. This looks like an animated slide. So this is, go ahead and hit spacebar for me, Randy.
There you go.
There we go. Yep. You can hit spacebar a couple more times. It should go through. Yep. So this is sort of the idea of, we've discussed a lot of this, right? So you've got at the high level, we've got all the security solutions that we're familiar with, CrowdStrike. I forgot to mention, I actually spent a while at Windows Defender EDR as a researcher there. But all of these solutions work in generally the same manner, right? They're going to, if we're looking at the left side, they're looking at, asking Windows event. They're basically watching the ETW events inside of Windows, which for the uninitiated, you'd be surprised how much logging there actually is on a Windows computer. But they're really just taking these series of events, they're sending them back to a cloud, and they're trying to do sort of correlation of, say, I see an email somebody opens an email, they open a PDF, this PDF all of a sudden calls out to the internet, downloads a thing, and then executes it, right? That's not something that a PDF is supposed to do. That's where their detections are. When we go sort of to the left or to the right along the top, the FireEye's, McAfee's, the antivirus stuff is only looking at a heuristic of like, I know what this virus looks like. If I see it, I flag it. And then sort of the end of like Tenable and Qualys, it's more just interrogating the operating system saying, hey, I know what an up-to-date Windows machine looks like. Tell me all what your patches are. So it's very user land. When we get lower, down to the firmware level, there's really nothing. I mean, well, I should say Eclipsium does this. This is the market we're going after, is being able to do the same, looking at what firmware is on the device. Do we know it if it's the same firmware that the vendor is actually releasing, right? And then by saying we know what this firmware should look like, if suddenly you get Cosmic Strand on your system, for example, we can say, hey, we recognize the signature of this UEFI or this DXE driver that's being targeted. We know this is malware. And then even for things that maybe have not been seen, because as we talked about, so much of this stuff, we don't know that it's a bad thing until it does the task it was created for. But by understanding what the good stuff, what all the, what the standard firmware should look like, we're able to say, hey, this piece of this DXE driver showed up and it's got a weird hash. We've never seen this before. You need to take a look and figure out what this thing is, or send it to us and we'll look at it for you. And I guess we'll go next slide. If anybody has questions, feel free to ask. So yeah, so I'll go a little bit into Cosmic Strand. This came out Monday, and Kaspersky basically found this malware on some of the systems that they monitor, their endpoint products monitor. They didn't exactly explain what caused it. Like I said, most of these are designed to not do anything destructive until they're supposed to, or some of them are not supposed to be destructive at all. They're just designed so that, say your machine gets ransomware, right? You go and even if you pull the hard drive out and you change it out, well, UEFI may still be there. That access point may still exist even if you pulled the hard drive and put a brand new one in. What's interesting about this one is there was a blog, there's a Chinese company called Qihoo, that's a very large company in China with a very advanced security team. They actually found the first iteration of this malware back in 2017. which was about a year before the Lojax malware, the Lojax boot kit was discovered by ESET. But partially because when we look at the post, it was on a forum site in Chihu's massive network of websites, so it wasn't actually picked up by anybody, I think, in the research community until maybe Kaspersky went digging to figure out what it was. But really what it does is it targets ASUS and Gigabyte motherboards, and it will drop a replaced DXE driver in, one called CSM Core. And what this does is during the boot process, as UEFI starts up, it loads the CSM Core DXE driver. What this is able to do is then as the boot's going from DXE driver load, it's figuring out where the master boot record is, and then it's loading the kernel. This thing will basically inject code into the kernel saying, hey, I'm going to put my malware in here. The kernel's starting up before anything is, your EDR solutions haven't started. None of that is there yet. So it gets into the kernel, and then it's able to disable this software from Microsoft called PatchGuard, which is supposed to keep people from being able to sort of patch running processes in memory. Once it's done this, it's now running, as the OS boots up, this malware is running essentially inside Windows, and Windows has no idea. And then from there, the thing, after a certain amount of time, I think it's 10 minutes, it uses low-level calls through the network device. It doesn't use your standard Windows API to talk to the network, but it uses, I forget the actual interface, but it basically uses its own communications method to get out and contact this command and control domain and grab the secondary payload, which Kaspersky didn't really go into what that does. But that is, and it's very, very hard to detect this stuff. Next bullet point on this slide.
Yep.
Oh, and they're invisible to us, like it says.
Exactly.
All right. So yeah, so these this Conti stuff is actually research that Eclipsium published, and what we did was we started going through the Conti leaks, as they were called, and it was back right around when the Ukraine war started. Some member of Conti who didn't agree with what was going on decided to dump all of this internal communications, basically the user manuals for being a ransomware operator. All of this information just got dumped on the internet. The research team here at Eclipsium started digging through that, and what was discovered was conversations between Conti operators and their developers, basically trying to figure out how to start. They were basically saying we need to start looking for ways to exploit Intel ME to essentially take their ransomware business to the next level, right? By as I touched on, they can, your ransomware code shows up, the PDF that calls to the internet that downloads the thing. But most of these, the human-operated ransomware, as we call it, they don't just, it's not like NotPetya, where as soon as it was on the machine, it just ran. What these things will do is they will actually get a foothold in a network. They'll go in, they'll start exploring. This is how the ransomware cartels make their money, is they figure out, what is this business? How much money do they have? What is their, how much can we ransomware them for? To the point where there's even what we call initial access brokers that work with ransomware cartels, where these people's job is basically hacking into a company, establishing some sort of persistent access in there. They figure out who the business is, how much money they have, and then they sell that access to the ransomware gangs, who then go in, deploy their payloads. So obviously, post-ransomware, either you pay the ransom and you get your data back, or you just wipe your entire network and rebuild from hopefully backups. But the point there, the risk here is if Conti can do this, they can then say, okay, well, we're going to implant something in the ME. We're going to ransomware the business. We're going to get paid. And then we're going to come back 6 months later because we still have, access to the network. Or maybe this company doesn't pay. And they're like, okay, fine, rebuild your entire network and we'll come back as soon as you're done. And we'll ransomware it a second time and see if maybe now you're more interested in paying. So that's, this is historically, firmware attacks were something that it was this weird ephemeral matrix style thing that only the nation state actors like the Russians or maybe the US or the Chinese were able to do this. But now this is becoming something that your sort of common, if you will, cyber criminals may be able to pull off. Which is actually a good segue. Actually here, cyber attacks. Yeah, so we're going to get a little bit more into this Ukrainian attack. As the Ukraine war popped off, they started seeing all these wipers, and these are more sort of your NotPetya style wipers, right? It was just, coming in on an email, people trying to get an implant on a machine, and they were really just trying to wipe out critical infrastructure like governments, banks, sort of I don't know, a reiteration of the same types of more just wanton destruction in the civilian space as part of their, shock and awe campaign, if you will, during the war, right? You start a war with someone, but then all of a sudden you're shutting off the power. You're making it so they can't pull money out of the ATM. It's just like I said, it's a cyber component of a kinetic war. And I think we can pop to the next slide, Randy.
All right.
Yes, network devices. So this is actually kind of my favorite space to play in. It's as a network hacker. What we've seen, and I'll really go into the F5 thing. This came out, it was sort of in 2020, they had a very similar vulnerability that you could attack their management interface, and essentially an unauthenticated attacker could get root access to the device to run any commands they want. As I mentioned, F5s at a low level run CentOS Linux for their management side. So their management plane is Linux, and their data plane is their own proprietary code. What we saw back in May was another of these vulnerabilities came out, and essentially what it lets you do was, I have a thing about vulnerabilities that fit in a tweet. This was one of them. You could send a command with the curl command line tool for Linux. There's Python code, but it lets you run any command you want as root on the device. I actually done an extensive amount of research on this, and I've managed to build a way to implant command and control software on an F5, and by hiding it very elegantly in the system, my methodology will actually survive like a patch. So if you were to say, get hacked, you realize your F5's been hacked, you install the security patch, my implant will persist through that. This is something I started doing after an article about a group called UNC 3524 came out from Mandiant back in, I think it was April-ish. What they discovered was a threat actor who I believe they attribute them to be Russian, had been inside these networks, some of these networks for quite a while. They were, I believe, going for more extortion and stealing of corporate secrets. But while Mandiant didn't specifically name F5, they said that these actors had been getting in through like storage controllers and load balancers, and they did mention that load balancers running CentOS, which Citrix runs BSD, Pulse runs a different kind of some sort of proprietary thing. So it's fairly obvious what they were getting in as is through these F5s, and they were able to basically get into the network. And because, anybody on this call who has an F5 device, most of these things are running in a very important part of your network, right? They're load balancing your production servers. They might be handling your VPN traffic. They're usually very privileged access on these devices because they just have to have it. So they're a really good pivot point for an attacker to get in, and they may be able to now hit your server farm. They may be able to sniff, if you're using these things for SSL offloading, where their SSL accelerator chips handle the encryption across the internet, but then behind the device, they're just using clear text HTTP because theoretically, nobody can get to this backend. If I get on one of these, I can then sniff unencrypted traffic from the back of the device. This group was actually unique in that they were hacking these devices, but they were using their command and control systems were actually IoT cameras, which we kind of touched on. These consumer grade devices, or some of them may even be business grades, security cameras in the building or the parking lot, but they all have an internet connection, right? And a lot of these times, especially with COVID and everybody working remote, they have had, or businesses have had to make things available to their administrators over the internet that maybe they wouldn't have normally done. And obviously the speed at which everybody had to switch to working at home meant that, corners were cut. Maybe they couldn't put these things behind a VPN, so they say, just leave this thing on the internet, we'll use a strong password. Well, if they find a vulnerability, as, allegedly or theoretically these groups did, they hacked into the C2 cameras, they used those for command and control, and they were, getting into the network through, your camera, which is kind of egregious. And then we're seeing the same thing, right? If you look at the CISA known exploited vulnerability list that started being published in November of last year, a lot of the devices, a lot of the vulnerabilities that have been actively exploited have been network devices, right? We've seen Citrix, F5, Fortinet, Pulse VPN. Attackers are realizing that, you know, as the EDR gets better and as it gets so harder and harder to get, you know, access through an email or through a phish, you know, Microsoft just turned off macros. It's in the process of disabling macros by default in Office, which took them 20 years, but they're doing it. That's becoming a harder attack vector. They're realizing that these devices, these networking devices, are a much easier place to get in. And also, even when these things are, a vulnerability is found, it's a lot harder to patch the load balancer for your corporate site or your banking site than it is to patch your, you know, Windows machines inside your network. So these things will frequently run far outdated code just because it's, you know, it's a lot harder to do than updating things on Patch Tuesday. And I think we can go to the next slide. Yep. And then this stuff is kind of related, right? We see, as I mentioned with Hyper-V, and one of the processes I ran at Microsoft was this dance we did to patch. At the time, I think it was only 3 million servers that ran Azure. So there was a dance we had to do to patch Hyper-V vulnerabilities in Azure before we could ship the patches to the world. So, you know, this is a huge concern, right? This thing from Quanta where there's these baseboard management controllers, which you think of it like sort of like Intel ME for laptops, or it's like the ILO systems from Hewlett-Packard, where, you know, you can get into this machine even if it's literally powered off, as you mentioned, Randy. There's a way to get in. You know, you can, if it's powered off, you get into ILO, you can turn the power onto the device. So, you know, as these vulnerabilities or these attacks are found, right, if I'm an actor and I get into a cloud network, you know, these clouds are all going to be running primarily the same make, model, firmware, motherboard devices. So if I can get into one, there's a pretty good chance that I'm going to be able to use my access there to get into most of the rest of the cloud. And the implications and the repercussions of somebody taking over an entire cloud at the hardware level is rather terrifying. And I think we didn't, I don't know if we have a slide about Ukraine and the wipers of Randy? I don't remember if that was here. The cable, the satellite modem.
This is it. Nope, we're at the end.
Okay. Yeah, well then I will close with sort of a revisiting back to the cyber component of kinetic warfare. There was another attack that happened that people may have heard of. It was called Acid Rain. And it was basically kicked off within, I think it was hours of the actual, you know, tanks rolling across the border. What they did was they essentially, probably as far as anybody can tell, sent sort of the kill switch command and disabled, you know, tens of thousands of Viasat satellite routers in the Ukraine. And the theory is that this was to try to basically blind Ukraine to what was going on, impact the ability for people to communicate, you know, either businesses or possibly, you know, whether the military used these is questionable. But once again, it's sort of this shock and awe. We're going to shut down communications in a country before we go in and start invading the country. And then with that, as we talked about collateral damage with NotPetya and Maersk, there's actually collateral damage to Germany, right? This attack on these routers, because it's probably fairly difficult to say, okay, if you're inside a network of satellite routers, and you say, I'm going to infect all these routers, you may or may not know, okay, I'm only going to go after the ones in Ukraine. What happened here is they didn't go only after the one in Ukraine. They actually hit a bunch that were in Germany, which ended up trickle down, causing 5,800 and change wind turbines in Germany to stop working. So not only were they taking out communications for a country, they were now like collateral damage taking out power production for an entirely different country unrelated to it. So this is unfortunately the world we live in, and I wish I could say it's going to get a lot better, but it's probably going to get a lot worse first. And with that cheerful segue, I'll hand it over to Gary.
And I just want to say, folks, hold on. We've got some questions here. We have 2 questions already for Eclipsium, but your demo isn't real long, so maybe, do you want me to hold on to them, or should I hit you with them now, Gary?
We can address them now, Randy. Just
Okay.
want to make sure they get addressed. Yeah.
Yeah, Carlson says, does Eclipsium use an approach of saving a copy or checksum of my current firmware and comparing it later to with running firmware as a means of change detection? Or are you guys at the point of change detection and focusing right now on updating firmware?
Yeah, I'll get into that a little bit on my little demo here, but we do compare kind of hashes and reputation of firmware on devices to known good firmware from the vendors themselves. So that's kind of what this reputation database is. We also look at other heuristic kind of parameters on firmware too. So we're checking for changes. And then I forget the second part of that. We can affect remediation and update of system firmware as well for certain vendors and models.
No, I think you got that. And this is just a quick one for Nate. Since you're the threat research guy, Bradley says, does Eclipsium share your findings publicly? You've got a blog, right?
Yeah, we have a blog. We just put out one that we did on Juniper vulnerability exposure. I'm actually the F5 thing I mentioned. I'm speaking at a conference, so I'll give them a shout out. BrewCon in Belgium in the end of September. So I'll be speaking there, and then once I'm done with that conference talk, I'm going to be writing up a huge blog on basically the research I've done against F5, some of these attack vectors. If I can figure out how to catch myself doing it, I'd like to share that too. And then there'll probably be a pretty cool demo showing me basically hacking in through an F5, hacking into a server behind it, and then using that to pivot access from a quote-unquote what some might people call an air-gapped network, where it's not connected to the internet. These devices can't talk to the internet. Well, I'll be able to make it talk to the internet through my access on a load balancer. So stay tuned.
All right. All right. And folks, with the rest of the questions, hold on. We'll get to them. And go ahead, Gary.
Sounds good. And by the way, just to what Nate was just talking about, we do have quite a bit online in our blog, threat research. So definitely check that out if you're interested in going deeper on any of this stuff too. All right, including the latest vulns and other stuff that we found. Awesome. So let me spend a few minutes here and give you a little overview of kind of what we're doing. We live and breathe, as you probably gathered, firmware and hardware, and that's really what we're all concerned about here in the platform. So to illustrate that, I've got kind of our management console up. This thing is basically a consumer of our API set. So, if folks want to use any of this information in different tools, third-party tools, etc., you can kind of pick and choose the different data. But this is a pretty good representation and allows me to kind of get to the information quickly through the management console as well, but just wanted to point that out. So let me take you through this kind of at a high level here and kind of show you what we're doing. There's different use cases for Eclipsium. Everything from just, people are just, like we've been talking about today, just kind of understanding what firmware is and where it lives in my fleet, what versions is it running, etc. So sometimes you just start with the basics. And I just want to get, inventory management on the firmware side, understand what chipsets are running where and what version and what needs updating, and that's kind of around like inventory and devices overall, right? Other folks are starting to address and recognize that there's this gap in firmware risk management and vulnerability management, and they might kind of come here and understand, well, what devices in my environment have the highest risk? How can I remove some of that risk and take some of that risk off the table through updates or otherwise, right? Or even from hardware configuration that I missed, that contributes to risk as well. Some folks are coming at it from a compliance side where you have more regulated industries and looking at those firmware controls as well to make sure they satisfy audits or otherwise, government, financial, etc., often kind of qualify in this area. And then, integrity and threat hunting people and SOC and IR trying to understand, wow, I'm looking at my supply chain, even my endpoint supply chain or my deprovisioning provisioning process. I've reinstalled the OS. I've replaced the SSDs. But geez, is there something lurking on the chip side, right? That could be malware or something that's persistent, ready to turn on in 6 months, just like we were talking about. So it's the integrity side. I think one of the questions was around that too. Is there any changes to the integrity of the machine, baseline deviations from a baseline that I may set, etc. So all of these things are kind of different use cases that we kind of surface here. So if I just talk about them kind of a little bit more detail hierarchically and kind of go from devices to risk to integrity, probably makes the most sense here. So devices, and you heard Nate talk about both client, servers, and network. For starters, we're pulling the firmware information from these different devices, and depending on the device, we do it in a little bit different way. Clients and servers, we do run a sensor or a client, whatever you want to call it. Doesn't have to be installed, but it needs to run. It's got a kernel level component as well, and it basically gathers the firmware information, anywhere from 10 to 12 different firmware components that Randy's been talking about in this presentation, not just processor, not just UEFI and BIOS, but TPM, and you'll see the other ones as well. So we gather that information. We even pull some of the binaries to do that hash comparison that I talked about, and we ship that all off to a centralized server. It could be cloud, could be on-prem. And that's the server that's basically doing all the slicing and dicing, running servicing the APIs in this management console, allowing you to do other queries, etc. So, and that client doesn't necessarily need to be running. It doesn't run continuously. In fact, once a day is usually sufficient to understand changes to this firmware layer. Network side is done a little bit different. We use networking device we kind of started with. We use their vendor APIs and SSH and other authenticated access to basically do remote firmware assessment of those devices. And then we're able to pull back information on vulnerabilities and even threat detection and integrity on some of those models and devices as well. So if I dive into, just quickly under devices and device list, you'll kind of see some of your familiar queries around, OS and manufacturer and product and model that you may already have, tools and databases that can do this, right? But maybe I want to get into the individual components, and I want to understand where is that Infineon TPM chip of a certain version that packaged up those libraries that caused the Roca vulnerability, for instance. Where does that exist in my infrastructure? Really simple to go through and just query that. Or we were talking about BMC and ILO before, so where am I running that specific version of HP ILO, etc. Or even more general, where am I not running, where is secure boot disabled, right? Secure boot has its own issues, but it's still good practice to enable secure boot. So I want to make sure and understand where is secure boot disabled, maybe where am I not using Windows virtualization-based services, things I should probably still have enabled. So it's that inventory side of my devices and the firmware side and understanding what I have, okay? With that, by the way, I can group devices how I see fit, and I can have different policies on different groups as far as alerting or scan frequency, depending on where those machines may live, etc. So different ways to kind of scan devices and look at them that way. Would be a group, could be model, location, etc. So that brings us into the risk. And the risk, again, all on firmware, the firmware risk against those devices. And in risk, we're putting together everything from known CVEs and their scores. Also, configuration items and hardening. If a device isn't hardened appropriately from the firmware layer, in the firmware layer, it can contribute to vulnerabilities as well and a chance for attack there. Risk also includes devices that are outdated with system firmware or other components, which would contribute to risk, since I've probably got a whole bunch of CVEs that are fixed in the latest update. So if I dive a little bit more into, vulnerabilities here, it's kind of fun to go and say, well, geez, I didn't know that there are this many, vulnerabilities out there on my devices, the ones that I've scanned, and this isn't really a large number of devices that are scanned here. But you can see that I can look through my different components for vulnerabilities, and again, here's some of the components that we're scanning and looking at. Things like, I don't know, if I go to boot hole, is, I guess maybe I don't have boot hole on this one. I was thinking I did. Let me just go, because I did UEFI. 1 second. So I can go to things like, boot hole and look at specific vulnerabilities, and then look and see what devices were affected or affected by that vulnerability. Then understand how can I make updates to take that risk off the table, for instance. Or I go into more configuration item type things, is missing BIOS write protections. Well, that's something that I always probably want to have enabled. Where don't I have that enabled in certain devices, and be able to at least change the configuration of those items, etc. Kind of a fun one, I think, is, you guys have probably heard of it's more of a bug, but certain HP SSD drives failed after 2 to the 16th hours of use, basically. So being able to get a patch into that sooner rather than later is probably pretty key. So again, it's vulnerabilities, not only CVEs, but also configuration hardening items as well. And we have different ways to kind of enumerate that device risk. If I go in and say, tell me the risk, and the risk could be how many vulnerabilities, how critical they are, how many are remotely exploitable, and then also my update status. Am I outdated on system firmware or other components or not? So being able to kind of target what devices you might kind of go after first. And then finally, the integrity side. We're really looking at everything from, this would be a bad day, right? You see 14 implants across 225 devices, but don't read too much into the actual numbers here. And I could show you another example with tens of thousands of devices that are being monitored. But point being that we detect implants with, known IOCs for starters. And we dynamically can do that. So as soon as we have a vulnerability or a known IOC, we verify it, it hits the platform, so on next scan, folks can understand if that affects any of their devices. So there's known IOCs, other integrity failures, by which we mean, there's one binary out of 500 that's not matching the known good from the vendor. That's unusual. And furthermore, it's not matching heuristic scans that we have. This is also unusual and reason to look further about an integrity failure. Could it be a 0-day? Not sure, but something that you should probably check out. Also to kind of the supply chain use case and some others, being able to set a baseline at a known good place or configuration. So saying at this point, I've reinstalled OS and maybe even taken out SSDs, etc. I've scanned for firmware threats, etc. I want to put a line in the sand now. I know this is good. Now I'm issuing this out to the field. Maybe it's going to more risky location. Maybe it's being traveled with to other locations that have some risk. I want to know if there's any specific changes to bootloader, UEFI, etc., certain TPM registers even. I can set that up and understand and alert on any changes to that. So last, I just kind of wanted to show you at the device level what we're doing. So here I'm just going to go into a device to kind of illustrate. This is running like it's a ThinkPad running Linux. What I really wanted to show here is scroll down a little bit. Here's where we're getting into those components, I think probably all of which Randy was talking about, and they're pieces of firmware. You know, there are some other tools that kind of scan system firmware or maybe processor and look for Spectre and Meltdown and things that we all heard about. But, you know, since this is what we kind of live and breathe, we go as deep as possible on, you know, all these components. And what we're looking for, you can see kind of the traffic light approach here. The reds and the greens and the different icons, these are all highlighting integrity changes for these guys, vulnerabilities, other changes to the component that you might want to know about, and then finally updates and other updated versions and stuff. And then this all kind of propagates up to overall integrity and overall risk for this device, and then finally up to the very top level for your whole fleet. So you can kind of drill down and understand, okay, you know, this is the risk that I'm kind of faced with, or this is a, you know, a threat that I need to take care of. Depending on that, you know, how do you kind of remediate that or mitigate that? So in this example, for instance, this actually happens to be infected. You know, we verified this via a known IOC, FinSpy, or, you know, I think it's FinFisher, was a surveillance kit that just recently discovered maybe not recently, maybe it was a year ago, discovered to start including components to affect firmware. So we found evidence of that. Even if we didn't have a known IOC here, the point is that it's saying, hey, you know what, there's also a potential threat. It looks like maybe some sort of a 0-day, some unknown binaries. You should check that out. Something's unusual here. So that's the ability to kind of look at changes that may be suspect but aren't necessarily IOCs. And then finally, we're highlighting different vulnerabilities on this device. Does it have the latest firmware on it, etc. Okay. Here's just at last here one additional device. This one was a Dell Latitude, and you can see this failed the reputation check because just one binary out of, you know, the 523 system firmware binaries didn't match. That's unusual. Furthermore, it didn't match analysis, so that would be kind of cause for concern. And yeah, I think that's probably, this is just kind of cool for probably this audience, is I can even define my own rules against firmware components, and on scan, if any of these things, if it lights up, I can kind of do my own investigations into firmware rules and registers and things like that to do my own kind of checking there. So hopefully that gives you kind of a high-level view of what we kind of live and breathe. And, you know, we say identify, verify, fortify. So it kind of goes along the lines of, you know, understanding the devices and the risk associated, and then the integrity.
We got some great questions for you.
Yeah.
So Robert asks, Gary, how does the endpoint firmware report to the management console? Is it agent-based?
So we use agents to scan the firmware. It doesn't have to be installed. If it's installed, you have a little bit more control. It could be more ad hoc or even one time in the case of supply chain scans. But it collects all that information, and then it securely basically sends this package to our server, whether the server is even on-prem or whether the server is in the cloud. Typically in the cloud, it sends it securely there, where it unpacks it and then allows all the queries against it, whether it's the APIs or this management console.
Here's an interesting one from Matt. How do you handle firmware updates on devices that have BIOS passwords set?
We can do that. You actually can put in the BIOS password on here for that one-time update, or there's the option to remember the BIOS password as well. So kind of your selection whether you want to have us kind of remember that or not, encrypted of course, but there is that option.
John says, how does it deal with VMs? Does it need to only look at the host, or does it look at the simulated guest environment?
That's a really good question. Yeah, so for VMs, a couple things. Your best evaluation on firmware is to run on bare metal, right? If there is any change control downtime for those VMs, your best bet is to run on the bare metal and understand what's there. Barring that, though, depending on the VM and the hypervisor, you may be able to run on the host and get information, or you may not be able to. A lot of folks run ESX, right? So today we can do basically use some of the APIs and do queries, and we come back with about 4 components and some pertinent information, but it's not quite as much as you'd see with a bare metal scan. In the kind of our roadmap for the next 6 months or so, we're looking to basically run natively and be more integrated with, I forget what they're called, some of the ESX packages there, so we can get the closest to the host, and the bare metal hardware as possible, but running from the host.
So back to BIOS passwords, Michael says, is there a way to upload like a CSV of BIOS passwords because they've got unique passwords for each device?
Sure. I would have to check if we can do it en masse like that or not. I'm sure, I mean, programmatically there would be probably some way, but you want to make sure obviously that would be all secure as well. So,
fair enough.
Good question. Yeah.
Carson, can I deploy Eclipsium server on-premise, or is my vulnerability data being stored at the cloud?
Yeah, I mean, on-prem or cloud is fine, but that's a good question. It depends how air-gapped that on-prem service would be. You know, we have some customers that are very air-gapped, in which case all that reputation data that comes dynamically has to be done more manually, right? But if it does have connectivity, we do that all dynamically. It comes down to, your own servers, or of course, our service in the cloud.
Let's see here. Bradley says, could an attacker update firmware without changing the version number, thus evading detection that it had changed at all?
The version number, I mean, we're looking at everything from version numbers to, the actual hash and reputation.
Code, right? Yeah.
That's right. Cool. It was pretty, I mean, this ILO one that you guys were mentioning, I think Nate mentioned it, really stealthy. It changed the splash screen back to a previous version, so you didn't think, I think that was the story, that you didn't think there's an update or not. So yeah, we're looking at a couple different things to understand changes and then to alert on changes if that makes sense.
All right, so here's a fair question. Mark says, does your software lie above the firmware level? If so, is your firmware subject to obfuscation performed by the firmware to prevent your software from identifying the firmware as being malicious?
Right. No, it's a fair question. It's a fair question. And, I don't know if I have all the info on what we're doing to make sure there's not kind of the man in the middle or an obfuscation approach there too, which is totally very fair. What I will tell you is we're getting the information from kind of different sources and interfaces within the firmware. So, attacks like that may kind of obfuscate that info from one way of getting it, but not other ways of getting it. So we get it from kind of some different ways and kind of doing checks and balances across those different methods to understand, wait a second, this isn't making sense. What we're getting here isn't really what we're getting here. This doesn't compare to this correctly, so there's something goofy going on. But
yeah, multi-party attestation kind of.
Pretty, yeah, that's part of it. And again, the engineering and research folks will have more data on how we're kind of looking at that. Yeah, good question.
And I, when I have an opportunity to do this, I like to make my point about avoiding being a security cynic. So we of course always want to know what are the ways around a control. There's always a way around any control, but tons of our security controls and technologies can potentially be hacked, but we still use them because there's the assumption of we're getting in there and cleaning things up before we are infected. And if you take that assumption away, then you take away probably 95% or more of everything that we do. Do you follow me? And I'm not just talking about firmware. This is everything. Like you have an agent that collects security logs. Well, at some point, if that system is compromised, that can all be tampered with, but we still collect security logs.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah. Michael says there are no silver bullets.
No.
Or moving the ball forward is the question. Right on.
Big time. Yeah, exactly. I mean, just start with your inventory. Start with what you don't know. Address that gap and just start. You can't, it may seem like you need to boil the ocean with this, first day. Not at all. And none of our customers are doing that. They realize there's a gap. They're not looking at it. And they just start to take a little bit of this off the table, whether it's just inventory, a little bit of risk. And then you start to understand it more as well, right? It is a mystery to a lot of folks. So, just start to dive into it a little bit, peel the onion a little bit. I think that's the good point.
So Jason asked, can you scan and report on Chromebook devices?
No, not today.
Ola Heidi asks me, or any of us really, can a rootkit be eliminated from firmware? You can, reflash your firmware and probably get rid of it. But, back when, we used to say you'd have to wipe your OS. If you think you can wipe your firmware, the safest way to get a rootkit out of your firmware is to take a little screwdriver and get rid of any chips with persistent memory on them. Hey, no, I'm just kidding. Yeah, there's ways to fix systems. Of course, whenever you reuse anything that's been infected, there's always a degree of risk. Let's see here. Matt says, can you drill into the Intel management engine? Can you disable it? That's you know what? That's a subject for another day. We need to drill into that in the future, Matt. John says, does the Windows Defender offline scan do anything with firmware? And I've been researching that as Nate and Gary have been working on it, and I don't see anything where it does. I see no mention of firmware in the same sentence with Windows Defender offline scan. I don't know if you guys have any more insight on that, Nate or Gary.
So Microsoft they did release something for Defender ATP a couple of years ago that was supposed to be firmware scanning, but I don't know how well that actually works, and I don't know if it actually does anything other than just basic scans.
Yeah. So I was just going to mention quickly, some of these tools do some really basic scans, and again, they might look at UEFI and processor and maybe stop there and just identify a vulnerability. As you probably saw, we're looking at all of integrity and changes over time and setting baselines and all that type of stuff that those other tools are not. We're really complementary to those other tools that were, OS and above, and they might scratch the surface on some of the firmware. So, this is our DNA, this is what we do, and our founders are out of Intel, the company, doing chip security. So, it's complementary.
Hey guys, it's been great. Folks, I hope this was valuable to you. We had a lot of people here, and we appreciate all the questions. We'll be in touch. Oh, wait, we got a couple more questions for you. They just popped in. Matt says, does a modified firmware result from physical access or network-based attacks usually? Well, totally network, right? I mean,
it doesn't always have to be network, right? I mean, if you can, because I believe it's SMI is the system management interface, you can update UEFI from the operating system, right? So if you can get a foothold, in theory, you could rewrite some portion of it. You could drop something new. It's either, or maybe it's SPI. I get all the acronyms mixed up. But yeah, I mean, physical access is probably one of the more common ways to do it. You leave your laptop in a hotel room, you come back and it looks fine, but it's actually been implanted.
Yeah,
Jason,
I think we saw more physical access like a couple years ago, nation state stuff, but now, yeah, you can get infected through a phishing email too, like, kind of per Nate, what Nate's talking about.
With Conti looking at it, I mean, they don't get physical access, right? It's all.
This is right.
Hey, Jason says, users like a single pane of glass from various data sources for security, like a dashboard. Can Eclipsium data be accessed through an API or database query so that you could get this into a more general dashboard?
Yeah, completely. All of this that you saw is all API calls, so you could pull out any information you're interested in. We also have, syslog to SIM, webhooks as well. So if there's any of that data you wanted to integrate, you can do that as well.
Sweet. All right. Well, I think this is it this time. We'll be sending out a link to the recording and some other follow-up info. Again, thanks everybody, and Eclipsium, hope we get to do this again. Take care for now, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.